Dr. Teriba, good morning, and thank you for joining us on the morning show. Well, I don't need to give any further details.
Dr. Abati.
You are an economist. You follow the budget. You follow the economic story. Tell us your own concerns about budget 2025 in terms of borrowing, in terms of the parameters, the assumptions, in terms of the expectations of Nigerians. Because the president only yesterday was telling us that this is a budget of restoration and he believes in it, that it will work.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
And it's an important, subject, also an important point in the life of the nation, in our lives as Nigerians, the day before Christmas. The president has carefully timed this. We're making the proposal a week before Christmas, so we can have this conversation, and we can all have a week to reflect before the New Year dawns, and then it can be a new day. We can start the day afresh. I have to congratulate the president and his team, particularly those that are active in the making of the budget and fiscal policy, on the conclusion of their first full-year budget. Everybody says, yeah, it's 18 months in office, but the point is that it was only a year ago that the regime was having a shot at its first budget. And part of what we saw when the president made the proposal to the joint session of the National Assembly a week ago was some report card on that first. So if this is round one, if you made three or four round, key question, what have we learned from round one? So what lessons should we take to heart as we evaluate the proposals on the table for round two? In that regard, the Senate president did, suggest that the first budget, the percentage achievement was 50% on capital, 48% on revenue. And that for that reason, the Senate will be extending the implementation for 6 months. But the president, in his proposal, said that there has been a 75% achievement of revenue, and there has been 87% achievement in spending. So we don't know which of the two, because if the Senate eventually goes ahead to extend, then it will mean that the position of the Senate president, right? But if the president's position is the latest, that means if you have achieved 75% as of September, which was 3/4, of the way, then there might be no need to extend. And we will say that reality, that aspiration had indeed coincided more or less with reality. That's important because a budget, the way people talk about budgets, particularly these proposals that are on the table, is as though it's an end in itself. And that's can't be, further from the truth. The budget is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. It's an instrument. And many of the things you refer to, or that even the crafters of the budget refer to fairly misleadingly as budget assumptions, are actually the targets of the budget. So this is your catapult that is meant to help you hit your growth targets, that is meant to help you hit your stability target, it's meant to help you hit your devaluation target. But then we put the cart before the horse. We read those targets as assumptions. They are not assumptions. If you get the budget right, if you actually achieve what you desire to achieve in the budget, then those outcomes will follow. It's not that, I hear people debating.
But you refer to the fiscal side of it.
Sorry?
You refer to the fiscal side of the budget.
Yes.
What are the fiscal challenges that you see in this budget? Because some other economists have talked about fiscal challenges.
You've talked about revenue assumptions. I mean, how well did we meet? Did we achieve 50% or did we achieve 75%? Did we achieve 87%? This will be challenges. Because we are asking, should we take these proposals on face value or should we have a discount factor in our mind? And going by what the Senate president has said, a discount factor of 50%. That's okay, never mind what they say. We are talking about 7.9 trillion. If we are a 50%er, that means half of it. Are we together? You've spoken about debt. And you haven't, this morning, you haven't spoken about debt cost or interest payments. These are real challenges that, in the first year of the administration, none of it is new. All of them were as this regime met them. But the expectations were high that this regime was going to do something different. And of course, they said they were not going to borrow, but they have continued to borrow.
The president says borrowing is not a criminal enterprise.
Well, we need to, while not criticizing, there are right and wrong ways of borrowing. There are efficient ways of borrowing. There are inefficient ways of borrowing. And the quality, the foremost issue is the quality of the debt instruments that you issue. Some countries of comparable size of economy borrow more heavily than we do, but they issue higher grade bonds, investment grade bonds, and they borrow at a third of the rate at which we borrow. We borrow at some of the highest rates in the world, whether domestically or abroad. So we shouldn't create the impression that it's about whether you should borrow or not borrow. Part of the crisis that we have, that we thought of the budget that we have announced, is going to go on interest payments alone, is that we borrow extremely inefficiently, and that there are more efficient ways of raising liability. Okay. Then it's not just, you shouldn't continue to fund deficits year in, year out with debt. If you look at your balance sheet, you have debt as a possibility, but you also have equity as a possibility. The Nigerian government has and supports a very, thriving equity market on which the Nigerian government has no issue. No state-owned company has any issue in the equity market, at home or anywhere else in the world. We go every time to Europe, we don't issue equity. We only issue debt. And the likes of Saudi Arabia, the likes of UAE, Malaysia, raise money more heavily than we do. They issue equity-like bonds. They issue sukuks. So that conversation should get to the fore of the.
All right, yeah. Okay, so thank you so much for laying that foundation. I thought it was really important. But I know you've talked about it as targets, even though they are meant to be, the rate at which what it's based on, what is pegged on this particular budget. To say there are two assumptions around revenue and expenditure. But there are still concerns around this because a number of people have said that at best it's optimistic. The figures that have been whether targets or assumptions. In terms of revenue, even the benchmark for oil, the amount of money for oil per barrel at $75, saying that the market is volatile. Globally, it's volatile, so you can't put it at that. And so making it difficult, again, to be able to have an optimization of this particular budget. Beyond that, I hear you when you say that, and the president said this yesterday during his media chats, that borrowing is for infrastructure. But if you look at the fact that our debt servicing is higher than combination of what's been allocated to health, to education, and perhaps even infrastructure, it's difficult to believe that the borrowing will go only to infrastructure. Some of it will go to debt servicing. How can we possibly optimize this particular budget, understanding some of the challenges that have been highlighted so far in terms of making it almost impossible to execute?
Right. The reality of the situation, particularly given the level of debt inherited by the regime, towards the end of the Buhari regime, the debt stock doubled, if not more than doubled. But the new regime had also revved it up, added to it. I don't think that the new borrowings are going into any capital spending. To the extent, as you say, interest payments as proposed in next year's budget is higher than the deficit. The deficit is going to be 13 trillion. But it's going to be
16 trillion.
15.8.
No, 16. Yeah.
16 trillion.
Yeah.
So it means Nigeria is merely borrowing to pay interest. So let's just understand that you are borrowing just to pay interest, which doesn't. That's why now the last Eurobond issue was at 10%.
For a sovereign.
10%
For a sovereign.
on a dollar liability. That's reckless. So you are issuing junk bonds, and nobody should put Nigeria in that kind of situation. That one, key performance indicator for the finance ministry should be to raise Nigeria's debt quality. You shouldn't celebrate that I issued and it was oversubscribed. You should begin to speak to, if Saudi was going to issue a sukuk, it will most probably be rated AAA.
Yeah.
And institutional investors will gladly subscribe to it at rates close to what the US is going to borrow. Let Nigeria show that kind of seriousness. You've had, Dangote Industries issuing investment-grade bond. The Nigerian government has never issued an investment-grade bond. So let's get that clear. We shouldn't go on a roadshow to issue junk bonds again. We should start looking at assets, that we can securitize. We should stop securitizing income that everybody can see. We don't, actually have. And I was worried yesterday in that during the interview, the inability of the NNPC to make expected contributions into the Federation account.
It was celebrated by the president.
We need to look at, the FCT is a fairly good example in revoking allocations that have not been paid up. So why would we let the NNPC, continue with impunity
Okay.
Well, you are talking about NNPC accounts. How about CBN accounts?
Okay, Dr. Teriba.
Well, I thought that CBN
How about
has been
CBN accounts?
it's
Balance
subject of
sheet.
rigorous
Balance
reforms. CBN has been a subject of rigorous
Dr. Teriba,
reforms. I thought that we need to do the same to NNPC.
I think what you should even have said is that the president gleefully celebrated the fact that NNPC has not been bringing money.
Well, he says
and he's been wriggling his way around, he's been doing things, but the painful part is for the NNPC not bringing money into the coffers is debts that is not bringing that money in for him to be able to execute his project, and the debt is choking
well,
us.
the president says that in spite of the failure of the NNPC, he is able to find the money
Which is debt.
to do what he needs.
Which is debt.
Well, but improve revenue from.
But which is debt predominantly,
and,
because and look at the
partly,
deficit. I want you to talk us through. Please, can you just face your camera again? I want you to talk us through this idea of what they are now taught that we have a reserve for something trillion. You have over 40 trillion in your reserves, but the lives of people are not improving. The president at some point claimed that we have bought investment of over 25 billion in the statement. You've brought over $25 billion to the economy, and your dollar to naira parity is not getting any better. This new idea of 40 trillion in the reserve, 40 trillion, because that's the new mantra. And we are not seeing the effect of the 40 trillion in the reserves. What's the meaning of all of that?
Right. Again, that's one conversation in which we reported the 42 trillion, as though it's an achievement, as though that's where we want to be. Are we? Okay, yeah. When the government came in, it was 33 billion. 33 billion when they came in.
Yeah.
So we're hearing 42 billion now. But the question has often been asked, even by the whole world at the October meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, that is that 42 trillion not gross reserves?
It's gross.
What is net?
What's the net?
Amidst claims of monies owed by NNPC, for example, is this $6 trillion or so? So if you back that off, this claim of 42, and what else are you going to back out? What's net? And nobody has been able to come up. Central Bank gave excuses and said by January we'll have the net figures.
Okay, let's.
So why are we talking about 42 billion if we don't have it? And what matters for stability of the exchange rate? What matters? The instrument, is the net reserves. That is going to help you attain the targeted exchange rate stability. So I don't see any reason why the government cannot tell us exchange rate is going to fall to half of what it is now. But that has to speak to adequacy of reserves, yes.
As we begin to wrap up, now, one of the key elements in that budget proposal is that inflation, which is today 34.6%, will come down to 15%. Now, I know you economists, you are shamanists. That's why we talk about voodoo economics. By what Christmas miracle or magic would they bring 34.6% down to 15%? Is it rebasing that they are looking at, or what? And then again, they say that oil production will be 2.06 million barrels per day. Is that realistic? Because you were saying assumptions, those assumptions are targets. No, but there are specific things in that budget. And then that the exchange rate will be 1,500 naira to $1. Now, can you tell us how realistic those targets are, to use your own expression?
Right. The inflation that we've seen is the result of the weakness of the exchange rate. And the lesson we have learned from the efforts of the central bank to tighten all the instruments all the policy levers available to it since February has not achieved any improvement relative to where the exchange rate and inflation were in February. Hasn't achieved any improvement. The lesson is that reserves are key. That unless you achieve reserve adequacy, you are not going to be able to stabilize the naira. And unless you stabilize the naira, inflation is going to come down. So whatever you can do is not magic. If you can raise reserve adequacy, and that's the kind of conversation that we should be, engaging with the president and his team on, that if we can take drastic actions to attract, for example, foreign direct investment instead of debt, which is just, kicking the can down the road. If you attract foreign direct investment, particularly into sectors that can absorb large, values of FDI, like the superhighways, but I would rather you do rail, than the highways, then arrival of foreign direct investment could lift both gross and net reserves and produce, rapid improvements in exchange rates overnight, and similarly produce rapid improvements in inflation overnight. So 5% inflation is possible next year.
5%?
Is possible.
15%.
Look at what happened in Argentina, So please, it's possible. It's a question of what government does. Economists don't prophesy. Economists make conditional statements. That if government if the president can make the kind of efforts we are making on tax and finance acts, if we, make efforts to do an investment act and get $50 billion in FDI over the next 1 year, exchange rates will improve.
Okay.
And inflation will go to single digits.